The Beatles are the most successful musicians in history. Just last year, 60 years after Beatlemania swept the world, they're back at number one with a brand new single. Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, he was a huge Beatles fan. He named his company Apple, the same name the Beatles gave theirs. He played Beatles music to demonstrate the very first iPod. The Mac's startup chime is inspired by the Beatles song, A Day in the Life. And Steve Jobs said this: "My model for management is the Beatles. They were four very talented guys who kept each other's negative tendencies in check. They balanced each other. And when they split up, they never did anything as good. It was the chemistry of a small group of people, and that chemistry was greater than the sum of the parts. John kept Paul from being a teeny bopper. Paul kept John from drifting out into the cosmos. George provided a tremendous amount of soul. I don't know what Ringo did." Now, this quote's a little harsh on Ringo, but are the Beatles a great model for team management? I've done a lot of team building at startups in London and San Francisco, and over 16 years at Apple, including 10 years as their head of music for Europe. And I think that Steve Jobs was right. I think the Beatles are a great model for team management. I think Steve took a lot of inspiration when he was running Apple, and I think all team leaders can do the same. Let's start with recruitment. Now, the team of John, Paul, George, and Ringo, that was version 3.1 of John Lennon's musical project. Ringo, he was the new hire, and undoubtedly the final part of the jigsaw. But Paul and George, they'd been with John since his very first band, the Quarrymen. They'd already played over 600 gigs together. Apple staffed up important projects exactly the same way. The team that created iPhone had some new talent, but the core were Apple veterans who'd already proved themselves with iPod, iMac, Safari. You want proven complementary skill sets and also complementary personality types. In the Beatles, John was a leader, an intellectual, a rebel. Paul, a huge musical talent, but also a diplomat and a grafter. George brought a steeliness, but 2 years younger than the others, he was willing to take a back seat. Ringo, warm, funny. Lennon later described him as the heart of the Beatles. Using Deloitte's business chemistry framework of personality types, we can see that the Beatles, like almost all successful teams, contains a healthy blend of the four primary types: pioneer, guardian, driver, integrator. Now, it's unlikely that John Lennon was thinking about personality types, but he knew when the team dynamic was right. He also knew exactly what he wanted to achieve. The Beatles, they wanted to be bigger than Elvis. A clear goal propels a team. At Apple, we were trained to have SMART goals: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound. An example given was President Kennedy's commitment to put a man on the moon and bring him safely back to Earth before the end of the decade. Man, moon, decade. A clear goal that galvanized NASA. Legend has it that on a tour of NASA headquarters, Kennedy came across a janitor cleaning the floors. "Why are you working so late?" he asked. "Mr. President," the janitor replied, "I'm helping put a man on the moon." Now, bigger than Elvis, that's even more succinct than man, moon, decade. Specific, measurable, achievable. The key point is the team believed it was achievable. Relevant, if you want the crown, you got to topple the king. Time-bound, well, they just assumed that in less than 4 years, fashions would change and no one would be interested in listening to men playing guitars anymore. So they had the right people. They had a clear, urgent goal. What they didn't have was a record contract or know how to get one. They needed a manager. Who here knows the name of the Beatles manager? Anyone? Hugely important man. His name was Brian Epstein. And in the words of Cynthia Lennon, John's first wife, I don't think they'd have gotten anywhere without Brian. Brian is a great role model for all team managers. Firstly, he believed. When he first saw them play, he believed they could be bigger than Elvis, and then he was all in. Steve Jobs said, when I hire someone really senior, they've got to be really smart. But the real question is, will they fall in love with Apple? Because if they fall in love with Apple, everything else will take care of itself. Brian brought structure and professionalism. Each Monday started with a team meeting. Each Beatle received a carefully typed memo detailing upcoming appointments and incoming and outcoming expenses. Years later, Steve would run Apple almost exactly the same way. And Brian helped establish the rules for how the four Beatles would be treated. John and Paul, the primary songwriters, they would share equal credit for every song they wrote, either in collaboration or as individuals. George, he could contribute 2 songs per album. Ringo, he could sing on 1 song per album. In public, they would always appear together and as equals. Now, in doing this, Brian helped create a culture of trust and openness. And in doing that, he made the space for his team to do their best work, a space for innovation. So now we get to the chemistry. That magic that somehow made the Beatles more than the sum of their parts. There's lots about their creative process that all team leaders can work to emulate. 1, a freedom to fail. They wrote hundreds of songs that were never recorded. That's okay. Steve Jobs said, focus means saying no to the 100 other great ideas. Selflessness, knowing they would share equal credit for everything they touched. John and Paul were unafraid to let the other into their creative process. At Apple, we knew that we'd never get our names in the papers, so personal glory was never a consideration. There was healthy competition. McCartney's Penny Lane and Lennon's Strawberry Fields Forever were written in competition to be the band's next single. At Apple, we'd compete to have our products featured on stage by Tim at a keynote event. And there was positive friction. It was okay for any band member to say, that's not good enough. All organizations should strive for this kind of candid feedback. It's not always comfortable, but if all stakeholders see that the gain is worth the pain, it's incredibly powerful. At Apple Retail, they call it fearless feedback. Many hours are spent training how to give it and how to receive it. Tim Cook says of Apple culture, if you're not comfortable disagreeing, you'll never survive. As John Lennon said, being honest might not get you the most friends, but it'll always get you the right ones. The last big lesson is about being open to evolution, open to change. The Beatles were always open to outside influences. A team of 4 young white men from Liverpool lacks diversity, and consciously or unconsciously, they tried to fix that. George introduced Indian musician Ravi Shankar. John attempted to integrate Yoko Ono. At the 11th hour, Billy Preston, an African-American, he was invited to join the band. They were open to taking risks. They took huge creative leaps forward, not knowing if their audience would follow. Ultimately, they made the music that they wanted to hear. And they were open to change. By 1965, they'd achieved their goal. They'd sold more music than Elvis. So they made a new goal, to turn pop music into an art form. To achieve this, they stopped performing live. Arguably the world's best ever live band stops performing live so they can channel all their energy into the recording studio. An amazing example of focus. I bet Steve Jobs loved that. And the result? Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, considered by many the greatest album of all time. So, to conclude, the Beatles story, up to Sgt. Pepper, is a great case study of how a team can be set up for success. I'm convinced that Steve Jobs took inspiration when running Apple, and I think all team leaders can do the same. 5 key takeaways. Recruit. The Johns and the Pauls, they're obvious, but don't underestimate a George. And in my experience, all the best teams have got a Ringo. Innovate through freedom to fail, selflessness, positive friction, healthy competition. Navigate. You're going to need a manager to guide this team and help create the space for them to do their best work. Goals. Set smart goals. And when you achieve one, set another one. And stay open. Open to evolution, open to change, because tomorrow never knows. Thank you very much.